Dr. Daniel Reinstein. I'm a psychologist or neuropsychologist. I am also the clinical director of a small private school in Lexington, Massachusetts, called the Community Therapeutic Day School. It has a population of 31 children with primarily emotional and social and behavioral disorders. I have worked in the school for 35 years. Have a lot of experience working with children, both in the school and in private practice. I'm also the director of research there, and I have written a couple books on the model, one book on the model we use here at the Therapeutic Day School, and then another book on neuropsychological testing.
Okay. And your school, I'm assuming, is for kids with some of the more severe behavioral disorders that can't be integrated into schools?
Yes.
Okay.
The population of children here at the school are comprised of children who have not been able to make it into the public schools. Okay. But we also have what we call our inclusion program, where we have supported hundreds of kids, many hundreds of kids at this point, who remain in public schools in a variety of, using a variety of models.
Okay. So tell you just a little bit about the program, just so you're aware of what we're proposing. We're a small district, about 800 students, and currently we have about 6 to 8 students who have moderate issues. We have a co-op that kids with the more severe issues go to, that school districts throughout our area kind of all support financially, and that's for the, kind of like your school, it's for the more severe issues. The 6 to 8 students who are moderate, have moderate behavior issues, go to St. Louis. We're in Illinois, on the Illinois side of the St. Louis, and so they're having to go an hour more or less each day, each way, to programs. So we want to bring a program to our school so that they don't have to do that. The company that's been proposed is called Sequel Family Services, and currently they provide residential facilities for adjudicated youth, and they are looking to start developing programs of this nature for kids with moderate behavior disabilities in classrooms, with therapeutic classrooms, and with the goal of ultimately, as students improve, as their behavior improves, they can integrate back into the classrooms. So given that you have started a private for-profit company, I guess, what are your thoughts on public-private partnerships of this nature? I know that you do you partner? Does your company partner with public schools?
Yes, we have run actually 2 different programs in public school settings, one in the town of Belmont and another in the town of Arlington. At various times we've had, say in Arlington, we've had up to 40 children that we supported in the public school, from kindergarten through high school. Okay.
And what's being cited for our school is the cost savings. And from what I understand, the cost savings comes from the private company not requiring, for instance, unionized teachers or like the same infrastructure in place, like that we don't need a special education director. So could you kind of explain how you're able to provide the services cheaper than a public school is able to for themselves?
Well, there's a couple factors. The programs that we've run in public schools, we have had the public school hire the teachers themselves. Mm-hmm. So there isn't a cost effectiveness in that respect. Mm-hmm. We serve as consultants to those teachers and other support staff within the public school. Where the savings really comes in is that the vast majority of the children in these programs would be placed outside in private schools or collaboratives, which would cost the town a significant amount of money. In addition, transportation would be very expensive. So based on those alone, in terms of saving out-of-district placement costs and transportation costs, we save the school district a considerable amount of money.
Okay. Now, excuse me. Now you've been at this for a while, but the company we're talking about, this is their first foray into classrooms, into therapeutic classrooms. Are there any concerns that you think that we should bear in mind as this process goes forward, as we start discussing the contract?
Well, in my experience, programs that are successful of this nature have the full support of the administration, particularly the principal within the school, so that the classroom or classrooms are very much integrated into the whole school, that there is considerable support provided by the school for the staff and personnel working within these classrooms, and that one of our goals was to integrate the kids as much as possible into mainstream classes when appropriate, with support from staff within the therapeutic classroom. So the principal, the teachers, other support staff within the public school really have to be on board to embrace this model and really provide the kind of support needed for these kids to feel part of the school. I also would emphasize that the kind of model that we use is a very relationship-based model. It's not what more typically would be a behaviorally oriented model, and so that we put a huge emphasis on the development of relationships between the teachers and the children, but also really provide a considerable amount of support for the adults working with those kids. If those kids don't feel held and contained by the teachers and other support staff, then it doesn't work. And likewise, if the teachers and support staff don't feel contained and held by the system that's set up for this whole program, then they feel isolated, and it really doesn't work.
Okay. Now, you said your program works to integrate the students as much as possible in the school. One of the concerns of parents is that kids with behavioral disorders will be sharing common spaces, lunchrooms, playgrounds, bathrooms. How do you handle that situation in your programs that are at public schools? Do you keep them segregated from these common areas, or is there some oversight? How do you handle those kind of situations where the populations blend? Even in the public school, in our programs there, we had a range of children, some of whom had significant behavioral issues that were issues around aggression and so on. Those kids were not able to be integrated at that time. The goal was to integrate them as the behavior got more manageable, and there was no incidence of aggression and so on. But anytime a child went into a mainstream setting, they did so with the support from someone in the therapeutic program. So the kids were never integrated into the larger milieu unless there was someone there who was able to support them, until they had demonstrated the ability to be integrated without that support on a consistent basis. So it was very much, multiple steps towards that goal. But before they reached that place, there was always someone there to support them, to enable them to
leave a situation if they started having difficulty, and to really, process that with them. So there was an incredible emphasis on previewing and planning and integrating, coordinating with the teachers in those mainstream classrooms, that the communication is crucial to be able to have some sense of really how they're doing within that setting, but also for the teachers to really be aware of the kids' issues and what their needs are.
Okay. Now, the proposed class size, they're proposing 2 classrooms with 8 students each, approximately, so 16 students in total. For each classroom, what staffing would you recommend in terms of teachers, aides, or social workers? What do you think an ideal class ratio would be?
Well, we've found actually around 7 is ideal, 7 kids in a classroom, but we have had 8 kids in the classroom at different times. But with that number, what we did was to have 2 co-teachers. Usually what we like is to have one teacher who has been trained really therapeutically as someone who's astute in terms of psychological, emotional process and so on, and someone who has more of an educational background, but who is very sensitive to the psychological and emotional issues. So we have 2 main teachers, and then we would have an intern in one of those in each of those classrooms. The intern usually we would have from local universities, colleges, people who were in counseling programs or psychoeducational kinds of programs. But then attached to those classrooms, so there would be 3 adults with 7 or 8 children, and that would be full time, and then kids who go out to mainstream classrooms would be supported by one of those individuals. Attached also to the classrooms, we would have consultations from the speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist and so forth. So kids who are receiving speech and language or OT services, might go out. We might have one of them come in and run a group within the classroom as well. So that was the staffing.
Okay. Let me just share with you what our proposed staffing is, from what I understand. It would be 1 main teacher, 1 paraprofessional, and 1 social worker, and then they are also working to make this a lab school so that a university student would be available. Does this seem like an adequate staffing for a classroom of 8?
How much time are each of those individuals in the classroom?
I believe full-time.
Full-time. That's a 2-to-1 ratio, so that would be good. Okay.
Now, one thing, I did research on the company Sequel, and they've had issues, but reported, for instance, there was one issue where they had almost 10 times the use of restraint and seclusion. Now, these are residential facilities for kids who have gone through court, so it's probably more severe issues. But the issue of restraint and seclusion has been at the forefront of my mind since learning about this. And they had responded. That was back in 2009, and they did respond, and apparently they resolved those issues. And there are laws in place in Illinois to restrict the use of restraint and seclusion, but what protocols would you recommend so that our program doesn't abuse that restraint and seclusion against the students?
We never used seclusion. That would be counter to our philosophy, which is that all of the work is relationship-based. So if a kid was particularly disruptive in the classroom, there would be someone who went out with them and stayed with them. Our goal, however, was not to take kids out of the classroom, but rather that we would have an area of the room that was designated for kids to be using that as a kind of a calm-down place. And again, an adult would always be with a child in that area. There might be what we call a calm-down chair, a place for them to sit and pull themselves together. There might be some sensory kinds of areas where there's pillows or a tent or something like that, where a kid could, particularly with sensory integration issues, could go and, again, calm themselves. The adult with that child would monitor them, would be with them, would process what happened, and alternative kinds of ways of dealing with the situation. So that the goal was to really teach a kid how to use language to understand what they were struggling with and really think about different ways of behaving and or expressing what their worries or concerns or whatever was triggering them. So that's really how we approached that. We did also train the adults to use restraint with the kids. However, it was a very specific kind of restraint. It's what we talk about as like a basket hold, that kids would be placed in an adult's lap, and now, of course, that depended on how old the child was and how big they were and so forth and so on. But our goal was not to, restrain kids like on a 4-point restraint on the floor and so on. Now things are changing in our state as well in terms of restraint and the laws about that. And there's a movement to really discourage that. But restraint in the way we use it was used to teach kids to self-regulate, to bring their bodies under control. And a lot of work is done to help them do that more independently, to use the calm down chair as a way, as sort of a transitional object in a way to teach them how to be independent and to bring themselves under control.
Okay. Now, one thing that I contacted an attorney who had issued a complaint against Sequel and talked to him about that complaint had to do with they were using in one of their residential facilities a boilerplate, a kind of cut and paste version of the IEPs, which is obviously a big no-no. He said they have resolved that since then. But one thing that attorney told me that would be his concern about using a public-private partnership like this is that he worries about kids, the program being used as a catch-all for kids who are currently, we have integrated classrooms now for kids who have less severe behavior disorders or special education needs. How do you prevent a therapeutic classroom from becoming a catch-all for any kid who is just a lot of trouble for a teacher? And these teachers do have aides. These kids do have aides that help them. But how do you prevent it from becoming that catch-all?
Yeah, no, that's a very important issue. And that goes back to the kind of relationship that the private entity develops with the folks in the public school. And I think right up front you have to be very clear about what kinds of children are appropriate for that classroom, what the overall makeup of that classroom is like at any particular moment, and that you establish a very clear procedure for taking children into that classroom, and that it's a process that involves the public school folks as well as the private folks, that they have a very clear understanding of which kids are appropriate or are not, and that be very much on the table, that this is not going to be a catch-all for kids who are just having behavioral issues, that each kid has to be evaluated and taken through this process on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Now, the contract that we're getting ready to negotiate would likely have a probationary period for the company, especially since this is a pilot program. How long do you think that period should last so that we should give them enough time to work out the kinks of the program? And what would you recommend for a total contract length for the first iteration of this program? Basically, how do we know how long it will take before we know if this program is a success?
Well, in my experience and the way we ran these programs, there were market changes for the children within the first year. Again, I'm not sure what kind of model this company, Sequel, is using. If it were the kind of model I've been talking about and the ones we've used, I would expect that by the end of the first year, you would be seeing significant changes in a majority of the kids. Some kids, of course, are much more complex and would take longer and so on, but as a group, as a classroom, I think you would see something, by the end of the first year. And so what we did, and we basically, established a contract on a yearly basis, a year-by-year basis. However, one has to balance that with the concern about a sense of continuity that one would, and again, using the model we used, because it was relationship-based, our goal was to have these kids establish relationships with the teachers, and that the teachers would be with those kids over, an extended period of time, not on a year-by-year basis. So that's the tricky part, is to, if you're using that model, to really ensure some continuity in relationships, and that, more than anything, creates a sense of stability and consistency with the kids that allow them to become more stabilized and be available for learning.
Okay. So something like a 1-year probation and maybe 2 to 3 year total contract?
Yeah, I think that would be fair. Reasonable.
Okay. What are some essential components that you believe our district or any district should insist on in let's say in the contract to ensure that the safety, health, and well-being of both students with behavior disorders and students in traditional classrooms are protected?
Yeah, good question. Again, I think it goes back to the kind of working relationship between the two entities. That you have a very clear procedure, a clear process of evaluating how an individual child is doing. That as safety concerns arise, that you have a plan in place. For example, if kids are very aggressive and are attacking other kids or teachers, that you have in place a procedure to alert parents, to have them come in, to either remove the child from the school so that the other children are safe, or to have criteria for which you would make a decision about hospitalization, for example. So we have, at different times, had to hospitalize kids because they were becoming quite dangerous to themselves or others. So having those procedures in place that are very clear and agreed upon and are followed consistently, I think is critical.
Okay. And to that issue, it's a big concern for parents. What has been your experience in terms of the risks of violence from students with behavioral disorders? Is it how I don't want to use the word easy, but how skilled are the teachers at being able to prevent that violence from spreading or affecting kids outside of the classroom or in the classroom?
Well, that really depends on the amount of support they get. And when we run these classrooms, we have the teachers being supervised by a clinician. In fact, I usually did that. So I'm a psychologist trained in all sorts of ways, but I would supervise the teachers, the support staff, even the interns on a weekly basis, so that things did not begin to get out of control, and I was available on a needed basis to help make decisions about how to proceed with a child who was having really difficult behaviors. The other part of that is to really acknowledge when a child is too much to handle. If people are getting hurt, or this is a pattern that's being established with the child, then this kind of program is not appropriate. And I think you have to be able to acknowledge that and seek outside help.
Okay.
Excuse me, Shannon, but I'm kind of running out of time at this point. Okay. I don't know how much longer, how many more other questions you have.
One more.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Sure.
How should we evaluate the effectiveness of our program? How do you evaluate yours, and what benchmarks do you think are most important to monitor?
Well, again, that's going to be unique for each child. So the kinds of benchmarks, say, for a child who is out of control, who is not accessing curriculum, who's really not able to learn, that would follow a certain pattern. That, first and foremost, are we stabilizing behavior so that the child is able to be present in a classroom? Then we start looking at the next layer, which is what kind of relationships they're making, whether or not they're connecting with teachers, other children, and so on. And then, looking at whether or not they're spending time accessing learning. And so that the academic progress doesn't come first. Where we come at this is that, kids can't access curriculum unless there's a certain amount of stability emotionally, behaviorally, psychologically. Once that is in place, our experience has been that kids, unless there are, other very significant cognitive issues, they tend to make significant progress then. So there's a kind of accelerated pace where they're, improving academically. So that's a general kind of way of looking at it.
Okay. Well, thank you so